Chapter 45, William Slack. On Christmas Day, Warden Matthews decided to pay a surprise visit to the Cuban units. As he and Bill Slack walked from cell to cell wishing the detainees a Merry Christmas, one of them began to applaud. He said in broken English that he was showing his appreciation to Slack. 2 weeks earlier, Slack had brought a Polaroid camera, white shirt, black tie, and sport jacket into the cell house. He told the detainees they could each put on the clothes and have their picture taken in an area of the cell house where the cells and bars wouldn't be visible. They could mail the pictures to their wives, friends, and family enclosed with Christmas cards that were donated to them by local card manufacturer. The Cuban said he had been in prison for 7 years and this was his first photograph that he had been able to send home to his children. Slack grinned sheepishly, told the Cuban in awkward Spanish, Feliz Navidad, and continued down the tiers with Matthews. Then the man in the next cell also applauded, and suddenly the entire tier began clapping for Slack. As he and Matthews walked up and down the 5 levels, inmates stood at the front of their cells cheering and applauding. Matthews was exuberant when he left the unit. Slack beamed with pride. 5 days earlier, guards found a Cuban hanging from his cell. He had committed suicide. This place is a roller coaster, Slack said. Highs and lows, highs and lows. Because the suicide was the first by a Cuban detainee in Leavenworth since the Atlanta and Oakdale riots, nearly all the major newspapers and national television networks carried the story. Most claimed the Cubans being housed in the penitentiary were despondent. The Kansas City Star reported that Warden Matthews had ordered his staff to perform a psychological autopsy to determine why the Cuban had killed himself. But to others, there was no mystery, the newspaper wrote. It quoted George Crossland, co-founder of the Mario Assistance Program, a support group for detainees and their families, saying, "These people have told me over and over and over they'd rather die than go back to Cuba." Reporters assumed that the Cuban had killed himself because of the conditions at the penitentiary. It made for a powerful story, but it was not true. He had left a note, and it explained that he was committing suicide because he had just learned that he had the AIDS virus and that his homosexual lover had just left him. Fred Fry, the prison spokesman, knew the reason for the suicide, but he was prohibited by federal privacy laws from releasing the inmate's medical records, so there was no one for him to correct the accurate news accounts. The incident disturbed Slack, not because of the media's faulty assumptions, but because he realized that the Bureau hadn't taken any special precautions to prevent AIDS from spreading inside the Cuban units. Whenever an American inmate showed advanced symptoms of AIDS, he was transferred to the Bureau's medical center in Springfield, Missouri. But Cubans with AIDS were not being kept in the same cell houses as those not infected. Slack began to worry about his guards. Whenever a Cuban was diagnosed as having AIDS, a notation was made in his prison file. Though the acronym AIDS was never mentioned, instead the Bureau wrote body fluid precaution. Guards working in the Cuban units were supposed to be familiar with the inmates' files, but Slack knew that many of them were never checked for records. After the suicide, Slack made a point of reminding his guards about the threat of AIDS, particularly when they were responding to emergencies that involved a Cuban who was bleeding. Each guard was told to carry plastic surgical gloves with him and put them on when he came into contact with blood. Despite Slack's warnings, few ever did. A few weeks after the suicide in C-Cell House, the guards who had worked with the Cubans received good news. The Bureau's Office of Inspections finally announced that it could not substantiate any of the brutality charges filed by the former prison counselor at Leavenworth. The investigators, who had never spoken to any Cubans at the hothouse, said their probe had documented some isolated incidents which indicated Cubans were treated in ways inconsistent with Bureau policy. But there was no evidence that Cubans had been systematically brutalized. It wasn't really a surprise, Warden Matthews said nonchalantly when we heard the announcement. But at Benny's that night, the guards who had been under suspicion had a spontaneous celebration. More than one had been afraid that he would be reprimanded. If I followed the best officer in Leavenworth around for a month, I could gather enough evidence on him to get him fired, said one guard. It's not that you set out to screw up. It's just that all of us are bound to make mistakes in this business. And that includes losing your temper and reacting sometimes in violation of Bureau regulations. Another guard admitted that he had been one of the officers who had violated regulations. I had a real loudmouth yelling and screaming on my tier, and I couldn't get him to shut up. He kept trying to start trouble. Finally, I sent my number 2 officer to get something from the office downstairs so I could be alone. I ran down to the Cuban cell and called him up to the bars, and when he got there, I grabbed his throat and pulled his face up against the bars so he cracked his forehead real good. I said, "You dumb motherfucker, shut the fuck up." And you know, after that, he always kept quiet on my shit. When asked if he had told the investigators that story, the guard laughed. Someone suggested a toast to the late Philip Schultz Jr., and after a few seconds of embarrassed silence, several of Schultz's defenders raised their beer cans. "I don't care what he did at home," said one. "He was okay at work." A few minutes later, a guard mentioned Juan Torres, the suspected snitch. "It's payback time," said one. "We should jump that prick in the parking lot and whip his ass." "Don't worry, he'll get his. It's just a matter of time." Everyone knows he's a snitch, and someday he'll get into a situation where he's going to need someone backing him up. And when that happens, he'll discover there's no one there, just like when we needed him to back us up and he wasn't there. None of the guards thought that Torres was innocent. It didn't matter how the investigation turned out. That fuck betrayed all of us by talking. Another guard added, "These headhunters will ruin your career, just like they did George, because he slapped a Cuban. Well, if an inmate even looks like he's gonna take a shot at me, I'm getting the first lick. No one pays us to be punching bags." The next day, Slack happened to see Torres, and the lieutenant asked him if the pressure was off now that internal affairs had cleared the Cuban units. Torres said that someone was still writing the name Snitch on his mailbox. When it came time for quarterly staff rotation, Slack recommended that Torres be assigned to a guard tower rather than to be put in a cell house, where he would have to depend on other guards if there were a fight or a stabbing. Connor agreed. "I'm not going to let anyone drive me away," Torres said later. "I'm not a coward, but this treatment really gets to you after a while." Most guards, he said, refused to speak to him. Despite Slack's progress in the Cuban units, he still found the pressure frustrating. "This place swallows you up," he explained. "Just communicating a simple request becomes a major risk." The stress of 18-hour days was beginning to show. At his wife's urging, he decided to take a weekend off and go fishing. But as he was leaving one Friday afternoon, a guard nicknamed Beans, because of his Boston accent, came into Slack's office with a shot that he wanted Slack to take action on. Beans claimed that a Cuban had refused an order, and he wanted the inmate locked in an isolation cell as punishment. Slack recognized the Cuban's name, and he knew that the detainee was not a troublemaker. He also knew that Beans was. Slack took the shot and slipped it in his desk drawer. He would take care of it on Monday, he decided, when he had time to hear the inmate's version. Beans looked angry when he left Slack's office that afternoon. Although the fish weren't biting over the weekend, Slack returned on Monday relaxed. He'd only been at his desk for a few hours when guard Jacob Tyler came in carrying a knife. "Hey boss, I found this shank," he said. Slack picked up the weapon and examined it. It looked familiar. "Where'd you find it?" Slack asked. "Cell 118, said Tyler. Suddenly, Slack remembered where he had seen the knife before, and he recalled the name of the Cuban assigned in cell 118. Slack knew that Tyler was lying. "Want me to put the Cuban in isolation?" Tyler asked. "No," said Slack. As soon as Tyler left, Slack called in Beans. "What's up, boss?" Beans asked. "You planning shanks nowadays?" Slack replied, tossing the knife across his desk. Beans looked puzzled. You need to tell your buddy that if he's going to plant a shank, he shouldn't pick one that's already been turned in before. The knife that Tyler claimed to have discovered in the Cuban cell had been turned into the lieutenant's office several months earlier. By chance, Slack had been in there when it was found. He remembered it because of its peculiar shape. Beans seemed surprised. "I don't know nothing. I swear," he stammered. Then why had Tyler claimed that he had found the knife in the cell of the very same Cuban that Beans had been reporting on Friday? Slack was ready to recommend that both guards be reprimanded, but first he sent Beans to talk to Tyler and find out what was happening. A short while later, Beans returned. He admitted that he had been angry Friday and had complained to Tyler. At that point, Tyler had said, "I'll fix that Cuban," but Beans swore he hadn't helped Tyler plant the knife. Tyler came to Slack's house that night and admitted taking the knife from the lieutenant's office and lying about finding it in cell 118. He was trying to help out. Beans, he said, and pleaded with Slack not to report him. All he had ever wanted to be was a guard. His grandfather had worked at the penitentiary, and Tyler wanted to make the old man proud. As he talked, Tyler began to cry. "It's my life," he said. "Don't fire me." But Slack had done some checking on Tyler and had learned that other lieutenants suspected him of planting knives in the past. Most guards consider themselves lucky if they find one knife every 6 months, but during one 6-week period, Tyler had turned in more than a dozen knives. Slack didn't mind bending rules when it came to allowing a Cuban to keep extra granola bars, but he didn't like a liar, and he didn't like anyone who planted evidence. He suggested that Tyler resign and avoid an investigation that would embarrass him and the Bureau. The next day, Tyler quit without giving the personnel office an explanation.